I will play a background role, and I will stay in my lane. I will participate where it's appropriate for me to do so, and speak where it is appropriate for me to do so, and ensure that to the very best of my ability, our structures and systems work so that everybody feels that they have the chance to do exactly the same thing.
Of course, that clip leading to much conversation since yesterday about the final DA organizational review report presented to the Federal Council meeting at the weekend states, among others, that, quote, open quotes, it's our carefully considered view that the single most important factor in shaping the DA's current circumstances is a failure of effective leadership, close quotes. The key findings in the report state that Mmusi Maimane can be indecisive, inconsistent and conflict averse, leading to a lack of clarity and deep divisions within the party, and so on and so forth. Also saying that make way for a new leadership. Quite scathing. Hello and welcome. You're watching Unfiltered here on SABC 3, channel 404. I'm your host, Desiree Chauke, and we're going to continue that conversation that's been taking place the whole day. We'd like to welcome in the studio Dr. Soma Figeni. Thank you so much from UNISA for coming through today. Herman Pretorius is from the Institute of Race Relations. Thanks for making the time. And Professor Derkotze, thank you so much as well. Herman, let's start with you, perhaps. You said earlier you were wearing your EFF shoes tonight, so almost saying we ready for war.
Or just ready for a political fashion statement.
Your thoughts about the outcomes of the weekend proceedings?
Well, it certainly is interesting. I think what happens with a political party that continues in a healthy growth trajectory is a lot of things get swept under the carpet. As long as you're winning, you can unite around the momentum of winning. And I think what happened with the DA is that for the first time they regressed. The idea of through unity we achieve results has been challenged for the first time. And I think these debates that have been simmering for many, many years, I think you can take some of these issues back to 1999, to some of the recommendations that Ryan Coetzee then made to Tony Leon about the DP. So I think many of these issues have been simmering for up to 20 years. And the loss of votes in the May elections and subsequent underperformance of DA elections, and as the report today, or as the report states, its current position around 20 or just below 20% in the internal polling, I think that has led to a bleeding of issues that could for many years be kept from bleeding by merely applying the pressure of
You've
growth.
already previously stated these sentiments, but what we want to know tonight is, has Helen Zille resigned as a research fellow at the IIR?
She suspended her fellowship, yes.
So she is no longer active?
No.
In terms of doing research?
No, it's against IRR policy to hold public office and be involved in the way she was.
Okay, we'll talk a lot more about the decline that you're talking about. But Professor Coetzee, this report, it starts off by stating that it was commissioned by the leader of the political party, and he specifically commissioned Tony Leon and the other parties. Is this just to smooth over things, to give the impression that things are okay within the party?
No, I don't think so. I think from all sides, whether it is the content of the report or whether it is the current debate, it really indicates that there are serious issues that the party must address. The fact that they have taken a decision at the weekend's Federal Council that they are going to have a policy conference as well as an early elective conference are clear indications, and incidentally those are proposals made by Mmusi Maimane himself. So it comes from the top, it comes from him who says, well, I think it's necessary for, given all these turbulence that's in the party at the moment, that there must be some moments where we all come together and thrash out first policy and then preparing for the local government election.
Dr. Fiken, the report says it has 3 years under review, a period where in 2016 there was a resurgence of the Democratic Alliance, and then in 2019 suddenly a decline. How can the DA arrest this situation? Which is what the report seeks to do, really.
10 years ago, I predicted that DA would grow, but it will then begin to decline or reach a point of stagnation before it reaches 25%. And I advanced the reasons that are deep structural, besides the leadership one. When DA started, it was white English speaking. It then absorbed the National Party members, had Afrikaner, then later on it was the party of minorities, Indian and Coloureds. Then later on, as the last consideration, it focused on blacks. As it was doing that, a number of things it was doing, it was microwaving younger leaders who were not yet ready into higher positions, some not having even had the immersion into the liberal philosophy and ideology and all the stakeholders. Then the next one was the fact that you would then have a revolving door. As a party, you say, I don't favor affirmative action, but then you consider and you implement one of the most aggressive affirmative action programs.
What a contradiction.
Based on race. Now, when you do that, those who had been going through ranks are disillusioned. They feel alienated. So this is a deep structural issue. The second one, the country at this moment, the illusion of the transitional period and the honeymoon of liberation is peeling off as it ought to in a neo-colonial experience. People are beginning to ask, when do you end the legacy of apartheid, of colonialism, the apartheid geography? And some people in the majority ascribe some of the structural challenges they have, be it land and many other things, wealth ownership, to that issue not having been attended to in what they call the elite transition. So these are deep structural issues which would have happened whether you would have had leader A or leader B, leader C. And DA has been more comfortable in dealing with issues of efficiency of service delivery, fighting corruption, and clean governance. But they've not been comfortable with the issue of race and with the deep issues of the national question, which is dealing with the legacy of the past. So those are deep fundamental issues. That's where you are beginning to see chasm in terms of ideology.
Professor Pretorius, you've taken the bold step of wanting to tell the DA how to fix its problems. The African National Congress also agrees with what Dr. Fikeni is saying, that they are struggling to manage the internal contradictions. What do you suggest they do in this regard?
Firstly, thank you for the promotion. I'm sitting with a doctor and a professor, and I'm just a mister. But
you did send out that paper.
Yes. No, thank you. But on that paper, I think what Dr. Fikeni says is absolutely spot on. The DA grew itself into a form of schizophrenia in terms of ideology. By being an alliance rather than a party, it laid the foundation of a question of identity that at some point had to be faced head on. And I loved Dr. Fikeni's definition of microwaving young black leaders, because I think that's exactly what happened. And I think ironically that's perhaps one of the reasons that Helen Zille has returned to politics, because I think she sees that as a mistake, having microwaved those young black leaders, and perhaps there's a feeling of wanting to return to fix something that she might have had a hand in the failure of.
Okay, we're going to take a break, but I'd like you to hold on to that thought about Helen Zille's return, and you're watching Unfiltered. Stay with us for this conversation that's been taking place the whole weekend, essentially, with some developments that we will touch on later on in our conversation. Our social media question tonight: do the latest developments indicate the unraveling of the Democratic Alliance's transformation project? Stay with us. We'll be back after this break.
the DA is not an autocratic organization. No leader in the DA gets up and decides what the values, the visions, and the plans of the organization are. If you read the first chapter of our Constitution, all those things are very clear. And then we make policies on the basis of those values and principles. And all of us serve those values and principles, but in different ways.
Well, on Unfiltered tonight, we're having a conversations about developments within the Democratic Alliance, and we're joined now via Skype by Brett Heron, a former councillor within the city of Cape Town, and now a party member for the Good Party of Patricia de Lille. The diagnostic report of the DA that came out today mentions the protracted fight with Patricia de Lille as one of the reasons for their decline. What is your response to developments within the Democratic Alliance at this juncture?
Well, I think that what we saw over the weekend, and many of us predicted as we were going through 2 years of really internal warfare that I have never experienced. So, when a party loses its values or is able to compromise on its values for some people, but apply them to others, you start to enter very dangerous territory. So what we saw today was really quite astounding, where Herman Mashaba resigns as the DA mayor of the city of Johannesburg and is a member of the DA. And at the press briefing, you have Mmusi Maimane suddenly popping up as a kind of guest appearance, almost endorsing what Herman Mashaba was saying. And what Herman Mashaba was saying was not really kind to the DA. In fact, he was saying what I said a year ago, and that is that the DA is a hoax. It has, in paper, it says all the right things on paper, but when they are in forces within the DA that prevent those promises and those policies being implemented.
Brett, we don't have a fantastic line, but we hope that we will be able to keep you on because we really value your contribution. With hindsight, what conversations should have been held within the DA during that time, just leading up to your resignation with about 5 other councillors?
I think the most important thing that should have happened was for the DA and its leadership to stick by its constitution and to apply it equally to every member of the party. But the DA's constitution was used as a weapon. It was weaponized against some people and used, there were some people who were protected from the constitution being applied to them. And so you saw this inconsistency, which I found really difficult to reconcile with all of the accolades that were being poured upon James Self, who is the outgoing Federal Council chairperson, over the weekend. Over the weekend, we heard that this man had great vision, and that was really not. In fact, my experience was that he was party to this weaponization of the DA constitution against those people that he did not support or agree with.
Dr. Fikeni, wherever we have a conversation about the State Capture Commission, it's said that not all blame should be put on former President Jacob Zuma in the party. Is it fair that the bigger portion of the blame is put at Mmusi Maimane's door?
To some degree, as a leader, he has to own up to something. But as I said, he was dealing with a situation far more complex and beyond him. At some stage, you would hear Mazone, you would hear Fanao Stazen, you would hear several other voices, and you would wonder exactly who is giving direction. The intellectual infrastructure of the DA has not yet diversified, even though the party might have shown some diversity. I'll demonstrate this in a moment. When campaigning was taking place, Maimane was the face of the campaign. When in 2016 negotiations about coalitions, it was James Self, which means the intellectual. Now Helen Zille penned down her vision of the party, the regrets of the mistakes she made. And you do have a team of 3 white males to investigate how party has performed. Then you have 4 whites contesting for the chairpersonship of the Federal Council, which shows the pedigree, where people were saying, you may diversify the numbers, you may increase them. In fact, DA has been saying we are the most diversified party when 87% at one stage in Parliament was still white, in a country with 91% black, which means to them some sprinklings of sometimes relatively junior black was enough to say these are under our tutorship. That is the crisis that the DA will have to deal with, because right now they push my money. Who are the other senior black leaders with a national profile?
Professor Pretorius, Mike Siluma writes in an article where he says the DA racial nationalists, real liberals and revisionism. He says, indeed, Musi Maimane and blacks of his ilk, such as Pumzile van Dam, Herman Mashaba, Solimalatsi and Luyolo Mpiti, arrived in the DA all starry-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking they were brought in for their political brains, which the doctor alluded to now, and to make the party more racially inclusive. Now cast as 4 liberals, they are discovering, like their predecessors, the real intent of the admission into the party, which was for them to give the DA a token face of non-racialism, but to act and speak at all times under the tutelage of the white so-called liberals. Your paper was branded by some quarters to be racist. Do you agree?
That it's racist? Absolutely not. It wasn't. The point I made was provocatively made, and deliberately so. But it was very clear. I established the conclusion very early on that Mr. Maimane should resign as leader, and I don't think I'm alone in that judgment. If you're going to be a political leader, then surely your key performance indicators, like all people have in their jobs, ends up being election results. And if the DA had only had a bad result in May, but subsequently had better by-election results, then it might have been excused. There might have been some mitigating circumstances.
Yeah, but it wasn't getting better.
It wasn't getting better. It was, in fact, getting worse, with Davie Scholz now assessing that the party might have lost 20% of its support nationwide. And then I made the case that the 2 most consistent priorities of South Africans are unemployment and crime. And I looked at all available DA leaders who had and explored who had the best track record on these 2 issues. And the obvious candidate ended up being Alan Windey.
Again, I'm going to ask you to hold on to your thoughts. You're watching Unfiltered. Let's take a break. We'll be back in a moment.
The events of the past few months, and particularly this weekend, have required me to choose between my party and my country. I spent the past 3 years in governing, working tirelessly to rise above party politics in an attempt to unite a broad coalition. The events of this past weekends have left me at crossroads where I can no longer ignore the internal dynamics in the DA and the continued attempts to undermine my pro-poor agenda in the city of Johannesburg.
That's this morning, the executive mayor of the city of Johannesburg resigning from both his party and his government post within the province. And we continue to have the conversation about the Democratic Alliance. We asked you to interact with us on social media about our conversation tonight. And Mdudziki Katwani saying the DA never transformed. They just applied black makeup on their face. The problem with makeup is it always wears off before the sun sets, thus requires constant reapplication. The DA took too long to change. And Begi Temba Keming Dlamini saying this is the beginning of the end of the Democratic Alliance. Quickly, Brett Heron, let's bring you back in. You just saw now a clip of Herman Mashaba resigning this morning. You touched on it a bit as we started the conversation. How's Ms. Patricia de Lille feeling about this tonight?
Well, I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to talk to her in depth, and Patricia de Lille can really speak for herself. But I think that she is seeing the events of 2017-18 playing out again. As I indicated earlier, the DA pushes out policies and manifestos that that appear to be addressing the history of South Africa, which is a race-based history, which disadvantaged black South Africans for centuries. But when it comes to the crunch, there are powerful forces within the DA caucuses where they're in government that do not allow leaders like Patricia de Lille, and certainly I attempted as well, to implement those promises.
Professor
what we heard from Herman Mashaba today is what we were saying in October 2018, that the DA says one thing on paper, promises redress. Every public representative in the DA cite the redress calls when they go through a selection panel, but they haven't fully internalized or believed that is what needs to happen in South Africa. And I heard the comment earlier that the problem with the DA is that it has remained an alliance. And I agree with that. I wrote about that last week, that it has remained an alliance of the disparate,
Brett,
and has never really coalesced around any coherent values.
I'm just going to have to ask you to hold on there. Professor Kotze, just unpacking quickly the events of this morning. Herman Mashaba saying that the collapse of the coalition was a foregone conclusion. Your thoughts?
Well, I think the cooperation between the DA and the EFF was the problematic part. The other smaller parties don't play that same sort of prominent role, and they are not going to have really impact on the election of the mayor, which in itself is a hot potato that I'm not sure everyone has thought through that yet. But I think what is going to emerge now is the relationship between the EFF and on the one hand the DA and the other hand the ANC. And who's going to ultimately convince the other one that they must come together in order to elect a successor.
All right, you're watching Unfiltered. That's the end of our section on SABC3. We continue the conversation on SABC News in a bit. Stay with us for more on this conversation about the supposed unraveling of the Democratic Alliance.
The election of Helen Zille as chairperson of Federal Council represents a victory for people in the DA who stand diametrically opposed to my beliefs and value system. And I believe those of most of South Africans of all backgrounds. I cannot reconcile myself with a group of people who believe that race is relevant in the discussion of inequality and poverty in South Africa in 2019.
We want to go to Congress in 2020 because we think it's important to go to Congress prior to an election in 2021. This way the organization can use Congress as an opportunity to launch the election 2021 going forward. I think that's a very crucial issue.
Well, Musimamani there stating their intentions coming out of that meeting over the weekend. And let's come back to you, Professor Kotze. Herman Mashaba stating that coalitions are the future, even though seemingly their coalition with the EFF in the city of Joburg has led to where we are today?
Yes, there's lots of difference of opinion about coalitions in South Africa. I think that the first one that was tentative was the one in 2006 in Cape Town, which consisted of 7 parties. In the end, that continued for the 5 years. But now we have, for example, in both, in all 3 metros where the DA was initially the leading party, that it is becoming highly problematic. I think that the core of the problem is that the EFF never wanted to become part of the coalition. They had sort of the cake and eat it, because on the one hand they wanted to be the kingmaker, to have the veto power in terms of decision making, but they didn't want to take the responsibility of being part of the executive. So that, I think, was the core of the problem. So it's not really in coalition. The coalition is with the small 4 parties, the Freedom Front Plus and the ACDP and UDM and others. But they are so small that they really can't play a significant role in the concept of coalitions. What we do see in smaller towns, there the coalitions are actually working better. The problem, it appears to be in the big centers, the metros, where the coalitions have become tentative. Think about, for example, Metsimaholo, which is, I think, a type of a model in which direction Johannesburg might go, is that it can end up in a stalemate, that they cannot elect a mayor, because none of the parties will have a majority or can galvanize an alliance.
But it's a good example of how activism can work.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that is indeed so. And I think in some cases, coalition is actually widening the political spectrum, becomes more inclusive than when you have only one party. So I'm hesitant to reach a general conclusion about coalitions. In some cases, it certainly can work, but then there must be a working relationship and an element of trust. It's not that they need to have necessarily the same ideology. If you think, for example, in Germany at the moment, the last 2 number of governments actually were the 2 poles that are working together. The Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. They are, in terms of ideology, quite far apart. But because they know they have no other option, they have to work together, and look where's Germany at the moment.
In this particular instance, the executive mayor, there was a relationship of trust between himself and the EFF. He's lauded how they were cooperating, but there were problems in terms of party structure and agreeing with this cooperation.
Well, that is so, but at the same time, in July, Julius Malema announced that the EFF will withdraw from all cooperation agreements, whether it's Tshwane or Johannesburg or anyone else, and not only with the DA, but also with the ANC. And I think that created the predicament where they are at the moment.
So, Professor Pretorius, the question that's being asked now is Alan Winde waiting in the wings? The essence of your paper was that these coalitions are not necessarily effective.
I doubt Mr. Winde is waiting in the wings, despite my best efforts. I genuinely think he would be highly effective.
Why did you put that out?
Why? Because I think the discussion needs to be had that we need to get away from race-based appointments in political parties, and political parties should be honest and say, we as political parties hear you, that you as the voters tell us that unemployment and crime, those are your issues, and we will elect our leaders not on what looks good on a poster.
So what makes Alan Winde your guy?
Well, poor Mr. Winde to suffer the pain of my endorsement, but he has overseen in a remarkable economic activities and growth in the Western Cape.
Within this short space of time?
No. As minister, as the MEC responsible for the finance portfolio and the economic portfolio from 2009 to 2018. During that time, about some figures say 500,000 jobs were created in the Western Cape.
Let's just agree that he was your own personal preference.
Well, by the end of that time, the DA the DA governed Western Cape had an expanded unemployment rate 14% lower than that of the national. So something was going right there. But if I might say one thing on Mr. Mashaba, there's one person I would like Herman Mashaba of 2019 to meet, and that's Herman Mashaba of 2016, because Herman Mashaba in May of 2016, in a speech literally called race-based politics cancer. And now he comes with this idea that anyone who doesn't buy into this idea is somehow right-wing. And he also accused my institute of being right-wing. He should be very, very careful about what
Helen
labels...
Zille has also accused him of that, but we'll come back to it. Dr. Fikeni, we can't underplay the assertions of Herman Pretorius, because here we are today, Helen Zille is back in office.
Well, Helen Zille is back in office with the full baggage of many risks. Increasingly, Helen Zille was tweeting, endorsing in a very subtle way some of the colonial past, which to a black majority is a no-go area. It's like saying Hitler in Germany at least built some infrastructure and think that Jews will actually be happy and say, yes, we can separate. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
If it can be applied to Israel and Germany and Nazi, it simply cannot work in this particular space. And secondly, Helen Zille, the notion of saying I'll be a background person, I'm yet to see a dominant personality who has been a leader of a party, who has written an article of where the party ought to go, coming back and just being quiet on the eve of policy conference and elective conference. She's going to be very active, and sooner or later, you'll have a friction.
Is it correct to want to punish Herman Mashaba for his time at the Free Market Foundation?
I don't think it is correct. In fact, to me, it was rather bizarre that Helen Zille decided to double up on attacking Herman Mashaba at all times. At night into the morning, it was getting worse. And it tells you that when she fights to the finish.
Yep.
And as such, there lacks an emotional intelligence to say, let me pull back, let me do this. Now it looks like every black leader she recruited, she keeps some diary and file to say, the day you cross my path, I'll read you a riot act. And that we've seen with Lindy Wemazibuko, Mbali Nduli, Herman Mashaba, and so forth. And then she pulls out of the bag, almost instrumentally, the notion that I wrote about Steve Biko.
Yeah.
How many liberation leaders who used to be elegant in MK, later on they make mistakes, then were told they should go to jail. But somehow she has this life insurance policy of going back and saying, do you know what I did? Once you use liberation struggle instrumentally, there are dangers in that.
So, Brett Heron, tonight Helen Zille is saying it's unfortunate that Herman Mashaba has resigned.
Well, I mean, it's unfortunate for the DA's stability and for their project, which is to project that coming out of the weekend they are a united party, and that she will bring some stability. So from that perspective, it is unfortunate. But to a large extent, it was inevitable, and she must have seen the writing on the wall. And I'm sure that there'll be more resignations in the weeks and months to come, as Helen is obviously not going to be a backroom player. And already in the media briefing straight after the weekend, she contradicted or asserted herself as someone who would be involved in policy space when she said that the DA is not an autocratic movement or party, and that policy decisions are not taken by an individual. So she was pushing back on Musi and his vision of one South Africa for all, whatever that means, quite stridently. So I think that the DA is in very, very dangerous territory.
Prof. Kotse, has a final decision been made on Musi Maiman?
I don't think so. And I think personally what he sees as the immediate future is he's going to try to consolidate his position, despite Helen Zille's presence, that he wants to use the two conferences, the policy conference and the elective conference, to
test the waters.
Yeah, but also consolidating. I think he will go in there with the objective not to see whether he has support or not, but rather to build support, to go there prepared already, and to try to get a new mandate for himself, which after that he will go into the local government elections and say, I have a new mandate from the party. So that these issues about whether it's Helen Zille or it is anyone else, to a large extent he can answer by saying, but the members or those who attended the Special Congress actually supports me. And I think that is the whole intention from my side in terms of interpreting, is that they want to have a little bit more consensus about policy. Lately, there was a fragmentation of policy. Think about Gwen Ngwenya, who had resigned as the leader, as the head of policy, because
her
of this.
biggest complaint was, I am not working on policy.
Yes.
Which is what I came here for.
Yes. So I think given that's in a sense a symptom of the indecision that exists in terms of policy, the fragmentation, as I said. So the policy conference idea, I think it's a good idea, but I think he's going to use it in order to put his stamp of approval on it and then move towards the elective conference with the policy conference behind him and there try to consolidate his position. So I think he sees in it an opportunity and not a threat at all.
Let's take a break. You're watching Unfiltered. We'll be back in a moment.
I respect and support the leader and the leadership. And I will do my very best to ensure that they are successful and can take the DA to the next peak that we have to reach. The stakes could not
We're not
be higher.
surprised that you had expected that he will never finish his term, because governing in local government is not as easy as people think.
DA is in bits and pieces as we speak. My Mane's position is also on risk. Our seat is very dirty.
There's so much is happening around our country these days, such that we so much lose focus in terms of what is key principles of life.
There's the public sentiment about our conversation tonight about the Democratic Alliance, and also on social media, on Facebook, Rikesh Ishwarlal saying actually it's part of the transformation, and if it splits on core values, so be it. The DA is unlikely to remain significant. Mashaba has garnered a lot of support, and it would be interesting to see the direction he takes. I suppose we all want to know the direction he's going to take, the direction the Democratic Alliance is going to take. But in that policy organizational report, yet again, one of the things they bring up, Alamu Muwawa saying they're transforming into a white anti-black conservative party. They've always been opposed to employment equity and race equality in general. I was just saying to our guests that the organizational report that came out, there's quite a list of things that they state, but one of them is that the party did not sufficiently plan for the ascendancy of Cyril Ramaphosa to power. How has that affected the Democratic Alliance?
I think there's, although I don't have evidence for it, but I think there is a sense that they miscalculated or misunderstood the message that came out of the election. Take the two main provinces, the Western Cape and Gauteng, where is the majority of the DA's support. There's a difference between the provincial and the national vote of around about 3%, where there's, on the national level, 3% more that the ANC received than at the national level, and the DA exactly the same, provincially more. My interpretation is that it was actually DA supporters who voted for the ANC, by implication President Ramaphosa, in order to, with this wishful thinking, or wish, that he must be successful, that it is in his hands to take South Africa forward. Musi Maimane, on the other hand, became highly critical of him. And I think one of the reasons for that, or explanations for that, is he wanted to present himself as a strong leader, as a principled leader. And one way of doing it was to oppose President Ramaphosa in Parliament, the way in which he posed questions, all sorts of things. And I think the electorate, to a large extent, became dissatisfied with this, because they felt that he didn't read the political climate accurately enough during the time of the election and immediately afterwards.
Dr. Fikeni, was the Democratic Alliance blindsided by Cyril Ramaphosa's ascendancy to power, and what have been the impacts?
Well, I do think that they invested too much on an ANC that was on an auto-destruction mode. And President Jacob Zuma and several other leaders at the time were the gift that kept on giving. Now, when
as
removed,
Zapiro would say,
once removed from the scene, and the ANC was even, at least rhetorically, saying we are going to tackle corruption, one platform was falling. But at the same time, I do want to say that it's always dangerous to say that there are parties which are principled in our partocracy. The opposition parties are more critical on public corruption, but on private sector corruption, they are relatively muted. You would wonder why. So that to me is not necessarily a sign of being principled more than being opportunistic. And as such, the same thing when now Patricia de Lille was saying there is corruption within Cape Town and DA was saying there is corruption within Cape Town. That narrative of DA being corruption-free after your Tswana experience, your allegation, it simply is that narrative that just went away, and people started asking, does DA model work outside the Western Cape? That's a fundamental issue. And Western Cape having its own unique demographic arrangement, that in itself is raising a question on the DA's aspiration to spread, have this black majority and so forth, whether it will work or not.
Brett Heron, speaking about that demographic, one of the things that the report highlights is the loss of support from white Afrikaner voters and a marginal decrease in support from coloured voters. How does the Good Party stand to gain from the supposed unravelling of the Democratic Alliance?
Well, I mean, our assessment of the election results were interesting because our support was across demographics, so we're not kind of boxed in by this notion that the support is confined only to coloured voters, and across LSM bands as well. Obviously the Democratic Alliance is a force to be reckoned with in the Western Cape. And it is in trouble in a number of municipalities in the Western Cape, which is an opportunity for us. And we tested our potential in a by-election in George, which we lost by 5 votes. So we are working towards 2021, and a strategy as to how we can be in government or part of coalitions in post-2021 local government elections.
Let me ask you this question that I'm going to ask all our guests tonight. One of the big topics around this conversation has been the classification of liberalism, a type of liberalism that needs to be followed by the DA. Where does the Good Party stand on this concept? And can you discuss liberalism without looking at South Africa's past and the real issue of racism in this country and joblessness and inequality in this country?
Well, I mean, I was in the DA for 8 years. I mean, when the idea merged into the DA in 2010, and I left in 2018. And I must say that throughout that period, Helen Zille was the leader of the party, and I never saw any robust clinging to the classical liberalism that is currently being pushed by a group within the DA as the future of the party. So, Helen's leadership, the party and abandoned what would be considered classical liberalism in pursuit of electoral populism. So I think that what's going on in the party is that liberalism, or the call to go back to liberalism, if it ever really existed, is a proxy really for a power play rather than anything that's really ideological. I don't see that in the DA that there was this massive movement or factional group, people who are pushing pure or classical liberalism, as is currently being projected by I think,
Professor Kotze?
Yeah, I think liberalism is one of the key issues. Despite what many people are saying, there are differences of opinion, I think, within the party very clearly. And it goes very far back. You know, if you think about the time when Helen Zille was still the leader of the party, she actually reprimanded the parliamentary caucus that they voted in favor of the amendments for the employment equity and black economic empowerment legislation. So that was still during her time as the leader. I think what has happened last year, for example, with the Federal Congress in Tshwane, Musi Maimane raised this notion of African liberalism, you know, which he didn't continue with over time now. So there is certainly a sort of a notion that the DA is attached in some other way to the notion of liberalism. But if we start to look at their policies, for example, the way in which they support social grants, there's absolute consensus with the ANC on that, and that's not a typical liberal sort of policy.
Stance.
So I would say it becomes much more of a hybrid policy or a hybrid philosophy that exists within the DA, which I would say is a good thing. You can't be completely principled and on philosophy that it starts to guide your policy during a time when the party is going through a transition.
Professor Pretorius, what's the future of the DA in terms of ideology?
Well, I think a fundamental point that must be addressed, that kind of is the shadow hanging over this entire idea, and I think we saw it in the Facebook comments as well, is this idea that the DA is returning to becoming a white party for liberals, classic liberals, and classical liberals being a proxy for middle-class white interests. But the data doesn't bear that out. I mean, from 2014 to 2019, the black support of the Democratic Alliance halved in Gauteng. It's not like that they only lost white voters or coloured voters.
The report says the opposite this, though. They say they gained support from black voters.
No, in the report itself, it has a table setting out the changes by demographic, and it shows that around 12% of blacks voted DA in 2014 and around 6% of blacks voted DA in 2019. But we must be very clear.
We need to wrap up our conversation, Dr. Fikeni.
Can I be very quick? I just think Mr. Mashaba is dishonest when he's saying that there's some conflict between pro-poor
What is
and
this
liberalism.
against Mr. Mashaba?
No,
Dr. Fikeni?
it's about liberalism. I want to make the point that liberalism is not against redress. It is for effective redress. We all acknowledge the inequalities.
He made the point when he was saying his resignation to say
I want to tell you that the years I spent in North America, what is called liberal here, there it is called conservative in many respects. So this notion that you have a classical liberalism is actually
we have
an
to
abstract
take our environment
concept.
into cognizance.
Yes, and then I will introduce another issue as a parting shot to say, I do think that there is also an existential crisis among some of whites in South Africa. They have seen in Zimbabwe and Namibia that you could have a situation where whites are completely excluded from political life. Whenever there are rallies, they go to play golf, do fishing and so
Dr.
forth.
Fikeni, I'm told we're going to be cut off air, so I'm going to have to leave it on that note and just quickly look at our poll for tonight. Let's just quickly put it up where we were asking you, do latest developments indicate the unraveling of the DA's transformation project? 72% of you say yes and 28% say no. To all our guests tonight, thank you so much for taking the time. Good night and thanks for watching. Until next Monday, bye-bye.